Welcome back to Proxamer, everybody, and today we're going to be looking at Craftworld Ulthwe and talking about whether they're still on top. So Arks of Omen has brought a lot of changes to the game, and one of the changes seems to be, for Eldar at least, that the elimination of the Hidden Path secondary objective has made defensive armies a lot weaker competitively. And to be honest with you, although I do think this is true for some missions, I don't think it was true for all of them, as the Hidden Path secondary obviously wasn't able to be used in certain missions, especially in missions where there just wasn't an objective that fit the criteria of the secondary. So what we are going to be doing today is taking a deep dive into Craftworld Ulthwe in the Arks of Omen and seeing if the Craftworld is still really a top contender for competitive Warhammer 40k. But before we do that, I do want to let you guys know that there has been a bit of a lapse in content over the last week. I do apologize for it, but I was going through some, real life stuff that needed my attention, and I wasn't able to produce, as much content as I normally do in a week. So you can probably expect, 3 to 4 videos a week typically from this channel, and I think I only produced maybe one in the last week, which wasn't really the amount that I usually do. So I do apologize for that lapse, not letting you guys know what was going on, but that's basically what was happening. And also, on a side note, I did get a lot of your guys' list submissions via the channel email, and I have to say thank you so much for submitting them. I had a blast looking at all the different ways you guys have of building lists and, just basically giving you guys tips here and there. But for the most part, it was a really awesome, eye-opening experience, and I really enjoyed doing it. So if you guys do have lists that you want me to look at, I'll be more than happy to look at them and give you my feedback. Now, I'm probably not going to be able to do a list review on this channel of every single list that is submitted. I'm going to be honest. I got probably 20 or 30 submissions from you guys, which is awesome. I probably won't be able to make a video on each and every one of those, but what I do plan on doing in the future is maybe, once we get to 1,000 subscribers and I have a few more features unlocked on my channel, we can go ahead and do a live stream where we look at all those lists with your guys' permission, of course, and kind of go over it as a community and talk about what the list maybe needs to be improved, or, what ways the list can be better utilized and stuff like that. So I'm more than happy to do that. And I think that's the plan, is once we get to 1,000 subscribers on the channel, I have the ability to stream on different devices, and we will be able to do a live stream and look at those different lists and stuff like that. So don't worry if you guys think I forgot about you in the list submission. I am going to do that. I just think it would be better to look at 30 lists in a stream, instead of, each individual one having its own video. I think if we did a stream of it, it'd be much easier and much more clear. And then the people that are, the ones that have the list submitted can actually get some live feedback from the whole community at once, rather than just from me, which I think would also be helpful. All right, so let me know what you guys think of that, but in the meantime, let's go ahead and get right into the video. So, quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at the Craftworld traits, Relic, Warlord trait, and Stratagem for the Uthway. We're going to be looking at how the Arks of Omen have changed and affected the Uthway. We're going to be also taking a look at the units that are effective with Craftworld Ulthwe and Arks of Omen. And lastly, I'm going to give you an example of a 2,000 point Uthway list that is updated for the Arks of Omen expansion. So first are the Craftworld traits, and Uthway has probably one of the best Craftworld trait setups in the entire codex, because they basically get 3 traits. So the first one is essentially Expert Crafters, gives you a reroll of 1 wound per unit when you shoot or fight. Psychers also get a +1 bonus to the first psychic test taken each turn. Now this is very important because it's only to the first psychic test, so don't think it's for all of them. A couple of newer players that I know made that mistake when the codex first came out, so do be careful of that. It's only the first psychic test. It doesn't really matter with Warlocks, but it does matter with Farseers because they can cast an additional power. And lastly, they get a 6+ invulnerable save army-wide and a 5+ ignores mortal wounds. And this goes extremely well with Strands of Fate. And it also goes really well with Perils tests, which Warlocks can actually get. So check this out. Because this isn't something a lot of players are normally aware of until they actually suffer a Perils test. So when you roll a Psychic test for a Warlock, if you roll Perils, normally you take D3 mortal wounds, which could easily kill your Warlock. Warlocks only have at max 3 wounds. So there's a 33% chance that your Warlock's just going to get popped right then and there, right? Which isn't good. Farseers are immune to Perils of the Warp, but Warlocks aren't. However, in Craftworld Ulthwe, if you suffer a Perils of the Warp, you actually get the chance to save your own Warlock with this ability. So, for example, you suffer Perils, you roll a dice, and you deal 2 wounds to yourself, and maybe that kills your Warlock on foot. Well, now you get 2 chances on a 5+ to actually save your Warlock. So this could potentially save your Warlock from actually dying. So very useful ability, not only for enemy mortal wounds, obviously, but also for when you suffer Perils of the Warp. And next up, we have the Craftworld specific stratagem, which is Discipline of the Black Guardian. So this gives +1 to hit for Guardian units or anything with the Guardian keyword, and this includes support weapons. So this is really powerful on things like D cannons, because D cannons normally are going to be firing either with indirect fire, or they're not going to really have access to things like guide. So having a way to boost their accuracy is a really fantastic way of making them even harder hitting. And the cool thing about this stratagem is it can also be combined with another stratagem that I'm going to talk about in a second to boost the accuracy of support weapons even further. Next, we have the Ghost Helm of Al-Shazir. So this allows the Psyker to know 1 additional power from the Runes of Fortune. Also, unmodified Psychic tests of 9+ cannot be denied. So this is great for Psychic secondaries in combination with Strands of Fate. If you give this to a Warlock, for example, that's going to be doing the Warp Ritual Psychic secondary, there's not much an enemy can actually do to deny that and to prevent you from getting Warp Ritual. If you roll a 3+ as well as a 6 on a Strands of Fate dice, so that's in total, that's 9. And by the way, I know it says unmodified, but if you use a Strands of Fate dice to move one of those to a 6, obviously you can roll the other one, and on a 3+, that's going to be undeniable. So there's about a 66% chance that your power is going to be undeniable with the Strands of Fate, which is extremely effective. And that basically prevents a lot of opponents from being able to negate your Warp Ritual Psychic secondary, which is a big reason why we're so good at scoring that Warp Ritual Psychic secondary objective. As for the Warlord trait, we have Fate Reader, which allows you to retain an additional Strands of Fate dice for 5 total. And this is great for getting extra saves, Psychic tests, armor saves, advanced rolls, etc. for Strands of Fate. So I know it may not seem like much just having 1 extra one, but that could really mean the difference in a lot of cases, especially when you have things like Warp Ritual that, you know, benefit greatly from the Ghost Helm of Al-Shazir, right? You have an extra dice for that Psychic test, which greatly increases your chances of getting off that Warp Ritual Psychic secondary. So having these Strands of Fate available is really important and very vital to the Uthway defensive kind of playstyle. Now there's one more stratagem that's not Uthway specific, but I chose to mention it anyway because it's really good with a lot of the units that Uthway is good with. So it allows Guardian units to reroll 1s to hit. This is called Martial Citizenry, and it's available to every Craftworld, but it's also great for support weapons who do not have access to guide. So if you do want to spend the 2 command points for this and Black Guardians, if you can draw line of sight to an enemy unit, you can actually get a 2+ to hit with rerolls, which is absolutely insane. So you use the Black Guardian stratagem on a unit of D cannons. Maybe you move the D cannons up a little bit to get some line of sight on an enemy unit. You use these 2 together, you get 2+ to hit with rerolls. And on top of that, if you do want to use Fire and Fade, you can to move them back behind obscuring terrain. So I normally wouldn't recommend this because it's just way too much investment. I would normally just recommend using Black Guardians alone to basically negate the indirect fire penalty. But the cool thing about this is that if you're going against something that is really tough, let's say you're going against something like Angron or something like Mortarion or something like that, where they're going to have so many wounds that you can't possibly kill them hitting on 4+. So what you can do is obviously move them forward a little bit, get line of sight to that unit, use the Black Guardian stratagem, as well as the Martial Citizenry stratagem, to blow that unit out of the water. So yes, 3D cannons with these buffs on it will kill Mortarion pretty easily, and it will kill Angron pretty easily, especially with the mortal wounds and stuff like that. So you have a pretty good chance of putting them in the grave. And then if you don't, you can always, if you have like 1 or 2 wounds left on Mortarion or Angron, you can always shoot something else at them and take them out fairly easily. And after you're done killing them, you can use Fire and Fade to get back behind obscuring terrain. Okay, so now that we've gone over that, how do the Arks of Omen changes actually affect Uthway? Because there's been several things that have actually affected them in a bit of a negative way. So the first thing is Farseers and Warlocks, with the exception of Eldrad, because he's awesome, have all been increased by 5 points per model. So that's bad, right? Uthway was running something like 6 Psykers minimum in a list before, 3 Farseers, 3 Warlocks, maybe more, and all of those have been increased by 5 points. So minimum, you're looking at about a 30-point increase in your list. The second thing is the Hidden Path secondary is completely gone, and this was arguably one of the better ones for defensive lists in some missions. Again, like I said in the beginning of the video, not every mission allowed you to actually take this effectively. So there were some missions where you just couldn't use it. So again, it is negative for some missions. For some missions, it really doesn't matter. But it is still a significant loss, and, you can't really just hold an objective for the entire game and get points anymore as Craftworld Eldar. You have to do something a little bit different. Also, lastly, free reserves means that more units can threaten your defensive positions. So now that everything is basically can be put into reserve for free, you're going to see a lot more players bringing in stuff from reserves, and this could mean a lot more pressure on your defensive backline. So the question becomes, is Craftworld Ulthwe still a top-tier faction in Arks of Omen? And absolutely, I think it is, and here's why. First of all, it still has great defensive power, and especially versus more reserves, it has the tools to deal with those things better than other Eldar armies can. It has things like Forewarned, and it has a lot of defensive units that can use either screening or other forms of denial to make sure that enemies can't really assault effectively into your backlines. Shroud Runners are also cheaper, which offsets the increased cost of Psykers. And again, Shroud Runners are a unit you definitely want with Uthway because they are very tough for their cost now. For 30 points, with a Conceal and a Protect, as well as Fortune, your unit of 5 Shroud Runners can basically be unstoppable in the late game. And I know it seems counterintuitive to say that Eldar are very tanky. They're not. They're very squishy as a faction. But if you are able to put Conceal, Protect, and Fortune on a unit of Shroud Runners and run them up to a center objective in the later turns of the game, there's not much your opponent can do to actually get them off that objective without just dealing mortal wounds. And even against mortal wounds, they have a 5+, ignores mortal wounds from their Craftworld traits. So they're very tough to deal with. And honestly, in the late game, there shouldn't be much of the enemy force left anyway, and it's going to be basically impossible for them to be able to do anything. So a unit of Shroud Runners can be absolutely incredibly tough, and their large base size means that they can easily block out people from trying to contest the objective and stuff like that. And lastly, the loss of Hidden Path is actually offset by the buffed behind enemy lines secondary objective, which now gives you 3 points for just having 1 unit behind enemy lines. And this is the objective we're going to use to replace Hidden Path. And it does require us to change our thinking a little bit when we think about Uthway and we think about just going full on the defensive. We now need to select units that can play defensively, but also play offensively to get that behind enemy line secondary objective going, which shouldn't be that hard. We have a lot of units that can do this. Shroud Runners can easily do it, turn 1. Striking Scorpions can do it, turn 1. We have Wind Riders that can come in later in the game, and we also have Rangers that can also be put in strategic reserve that can come in and do it as well. And actually, as the rules are written, something I currently learned was that if you use Phantasm to put units into strategic reserve, those units can actually come in on turns 4, and 5. Normally they would be destroyed on turn 3, but because Phantasm happens after the start of the first battle round, or I should say at the start, it's not before the start, it's at the start, they're actually immune to the turn 3 destruction of reserves rule. So you could have those units that you used with Phantasm coming in on turns 4 and 5. So pretty good way of scoring things like behind enemy lines late in the game, and also things like scout the enemy late in the game when your opponent doesn't have a lot of tools to deal with those units. So what units are effective with the Uthway in Arks of Omen? And basically, much of the same things that were effective before the Arks of Omen expansion are still effective now. Support weapons, Wind Riders, Shroud Runners, Warlocks, and Farseers, and of course Vipers are some of the best units to use with Uthway. And of course there are other units. Wraith units are very good with Uthway and stuff like that. But these are the units that I selected because I think these synergize best with the new way to play Craftworld Ulthwe, which I would kind of describe as pretty much the same, very defensive, but has ways of getting into the enemy backlines and disrupting enemy units so that they really can't do much, and you can score high points on things like behind enemy lines and other secondaries. So this is a unit that's been very effective for Uthway pretty much ever since the new codex came out, and that is support weapons. So D-cannons are obviously one of the most notable support weapon picks. They have best in slot anti-large damage. They have high mortal wound potential because every time you roll a 6 to wound, they generate a mortal wound in addition to normal damage. And they have the blast keyword. So against larger units, they do additional damage as well. And in the age of Armor of Contempt, I didn't think that Shadow Weavers were really that viable of a pick, but with the loss of Armor of Contempt, I actually think Shadow Weavers are pretty effective at killing off chaff, which they've always been, to be honest. But they aren't that bad at whittling down tougher enemies as well. And against normal Marines, they're just going to be at their base armor save, or honestly, maybe even less if they don't benefit from light cover. So a unit of Shadow Weavers shooting at a unit of 5 Marines behind a piece of terrain can do pretty decent damage over the course of the game. So especially in Uthway, when you have access to things like Martial Citizenry and the Black Guardian stratagem, you can kill quite a few of them over the course of the game and force your opponent to actually have to use another unit to defend key areas of the board. And of course, what makes support weapons really effective in an Uthway list is that they can completely ignore line of sight. Even if it's at a penalty, they can ignore line of sight, and that gives them really high defensive abilities. So using Forewarned on a unit of D-cannons, for example, for deep striking demons, is insanely effective because you don't have to be exposed to be able to do damage to your opponent. And because of the cost of support weapons being a very, honestly, pretty good cost as far as points go, you don't really need to invest a lot in them. And to give you an example, Fire Prisms are also pretty decent in an Uthway list, but you almost pretty much have to pay double the points for 2 Fire Prisms to be just as effective as 1 unit of D-cannons. Fire Prisms do have their advantages, but they're much more resource intensive. And of course, all support weapons have the Guardian keyword, so can benefit from things like Martial Citizenry and the Black Guardian stratagem once again. Now, this is a unit I've actually talked about quite a lot in Uthway in past videos, but Wind Riders are still extremely effective in Uthway lists. So they do have the Guardian keyword, which makes them, a standout for Uthway. But before, you didn't really see a lot of these units because behind enemy lines, while good, wasn't exactly the best secondary to pick in every single situation unless you were running a very aggressive style of army. But now, since Uthway doesn't really have access to the hidden path very easily, well, not at all, you need to find other ways of being able to score secondary objective points, and I think Wind Riders fit this niche perfectly. They're extremely fast and cost-effective with the Shuriken Catapults, which, to be honest with you, I think is probably the best way to run them in Uthway, just because you are going to be using Wind Riders for behind enemy lines and also to screen and things like that. But they're also very good at trading. So for only 60 points, you can have a unit of 3 with Shuriken Catapults And they can do a lot of cool things. They can screen for you, but they can also be used to be put on objectives in the middle game and force enemies to shoot them off of those set objectives. So you can deny objectives from enemy units fairly easily, especially since they are core. You can give them the Will of Azurian psychic power, and they can be quite annoying. They aren't that tough, but they do have a 3+ save base, and they have a couple wounds apiece. So if you think about it, they're kind of like Space Marines in a way, as far as toughness goes. They do have toughness 4, just like a Space Marine. They have a 3+ save, just like a Space Marine. And of course, 2 wounds, just like a Space Marine as well. So again, that's not incredibly hard to kill, but your enemy is going to have to, focus a little bit more than just spare firepower to take them out. And yeah, Wind Riders continue to be a very effective tool for Uthway, especially with the adaptations that Uthway has to make with the loss of the Hidden Path secondary objective. And of course, it probably wouldn't be one of my videos if I didn't mention Shroud Runners at least once. Love Shroud Runners. They're in basically pretty much all my lists at this point. They recently got a points decrease. They're very effective. They're extremely fast. They can actually score behind enemy lines from turn 1. So I think in an Uthway list, at least a unit of 3 is pretty much mandatory, because basically what you can do with these guys is you can put them in the enemy deployment zone on turn 1, use their large base sizes to basically block entire segments of the enemy army from being able to move past them in the movement phase, and they can slow down enemy units by using the Wire Weave Grenade stratagem. So they are extremely annoying for opponents, extremely effective, and can score you points at the same time. And they're a little less, costly to trade in because of their reduced cost. So you don't have to feel too guilty about basically sacrificing a small unit of 3 in order to score on objectives and, block up an enemy for a turn. And alternatively, not only can they play very aggressively to score you behind enemy lines, but they have good damage potential. A unit of 5 used with Guide has great range, can stay back and shoot in the early game and do really good damage until in the late game they can come out and score on primary objectives. Now, the thing about Shroud Runners not a lot of people realize right now is that they're actually very tough. Let me give you an example. If you're running an Uthway list, you're probably going to be running Conceal, you're probably going to be running Protect, and you're probably going to be running something like Fortune as well, right? So a unit of 5 of these guys with Conceal, Protect, and Fortune, as well as the normal Uthway traits, are going to be extremely hard to take out on objectives, pretty much impossible for a late game opponent to take out unless you, of course, are getting just steamrolled. And you probably shouldn't be getting steamrolled as an Uthway list because it is very defensive. You do have multiple tools to deal with alpha strikes and stuff like that. So opponents are probably going to have to play a more tactical game against you, and not every opponent can actually do that successfully. And just to give you an example of how tough these guys are on an objective, I previously played a game recently where all the psyche powers went off. I banked Strands of Fate to be able to pass those psyche tests, and I was sitting on a 1+ save with a Fortune and also, of course, the 6+ Invul on turn 5, and there was just nothing my opponent could do about it. And my opponent had a significant amount of stuff that he could have used, but he just couldn't do anything. And then, of course, he did have an assault unit. He tried to assault in a Dreadnought, and the Dreadnought never got there. And that was because of the Wire Weave Grenade stratagem, which reduced the Dreadnought's charge distance by a significant amount. So the Dreadnought, A, couldn't really shoot them effectively, B, couldn't charge them, and therefore couldn't get on the objective. Now, of course, even if the Dreadnought did charge in and made it with a really good charge roll, it probably still wouldn't have been able to do anything because these guys had objectives secured and had very big bases, so were basically blocking the objective from getting captured. And I think, by the way, with the Will of Azurian psychic power, I think it's basically necessary for a defensive Uthway list to be able to run properly so that you can do things like this to basically force your enemy into a situation where they can't really do anything about your units in the late game. And of course, on to Warlocks and Farseers. So pretty obvious here, all Warlocks and Farseers get +1 to psychic powers on their first test taken. and this makes it nearly impossible to fail the psychic secondary actions. So I'm going to be honest with you guys, you're probably not going to be using psychic interrogation anymore. I hate to say it, but it's very hard to get off now with line of sight being required. You're probably just not going to be able to use it effectively. And to be honest with you, I often found myself using Warp Ritual anyway. Anytime an enemy had at least 1 or 2 psychers in their list, I would often just say, you know what, forget it. I'm just going to go ahead and go with Warp Ritual because I don't want my psychic interrogation to be getting canceled by Deny the Witch every single turn, which can happen if you're rolling bad. And also, just as a side note, with the Uthway relic, high rolls on psychic tests cannot be denied. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can run it on a Farseer, and the Farseer can have really undeniable psychic powers, which is really good. However, my advice would actually to put it on a Warlock Skyrunner that is going to be casting the Warp Ritual psychic power. Or psychic secondary, excuse me. And the reason for this is because a good opponent will place a Psyker within 24 inches of the center of the board in order to deny the Warp Ritual psychic action. And this is a very common tactic, especially with opponents that have access to denials. You won't see this in every list. You won't always see Dark Eldar doing this. I know they have like a relic or something like that gives you a Deny the Witch, but you won't always see Dark Eldar being able to do that. You won't always see Tau being able to do that. And honestly, you probably won't always be seeing Votann able to do that, even though they do have a Psyker that's pretty effective. However, most other factions will at least have one Psyker for this exact purpose, to be able to deny enemy psychic secondaries. Even Imperial Guard, by the way, will usually have 1 or 2 Psychers thrown in there just to deny psychic powers. So having the ability to make your psychic tests undeniable with a Strands of Fate and a 3+ roll is absolutely fantastic, and I can't say enough good things about it in an Uthway list that's going to be running Warp Ritual, which honestly you should always be doing. I know that, I'm not somebody who says, you should always run this or you should always run that, but I think with Uthway, it's one of those things where it's so effective, and Uthway is designed around psychic powers anyway. I think you really do have to run it like that. Anyway, so, or, at least run the Warp Ritual secondary. You can run the relic on anything you want, but it is effective on the Warlock for this exact purpose. And something I mentioned earlier in the video as well, but I'm going to go ahead and reiterate it. They do also have a 5+ ignores mortals. This is easily forgotten when taking perils checks. So if you roll a perils on a psychic test, which honestly will probably happen on a Warlock at least once a game, right? Normally a Skyrunner is going to be pretty safe. You're going to probably take a couple wounds, but you're not going to die. That's why I like to take Skyrunners, because they have 3 wounds apiece. However, when you are running Uthway, you are going to get a 5+ ignores mortals against those. So let's say that you roll bad and you roll a 5 or 6 on your perils, and your Warlock Skyrunner is going to die. Well, now you get 3 chances to get a 5+ on one of those, which on average you should pass at least one of those, and your Warlock Skyrunner can survive. So this is a really great way of actually mitigating the risk of running into perils of the warp, which means you don't always have to run 2 Warlocks on foot. And a lot of players will run 2 Warlocks on foot because that's 4 wounds, which means that if you run into a perils once a game, your whole unit's not going to die, right? Because there's 4 wounds there, the max that can be dealt is 3. I understand that logic, but when you're running an Uthway Craftworld, to be honest with you, you don't need to. And personally, between you and me, I actually don't like the unit of 2 Warlocks on foot when run in a defensive list, because if your opponent even has 1 indirect fire weapon in their army that can draw a bead to the Warlocks, I'm sorry, but that Warlock unit is probably going to die within the first couple turns. And just let me give you an example real quick, right? Let's say it's a unit of Imperial Guard mortars. 55 points for a unit. You could put Take Aim on them, so they can be hitting on pretty much 4+, right? Because you get a +1 to hit with Take Aim. They have D6 shots apiece, so on average you're probably going to get about 10 hits. 5 of those are going to hit, probably 4 of those are going to wound, and that's going to kill at least 1 Warlock a turn. If your opponent has 2 mortars, then you're probably going to lose every single warlock in that unit. And that's not even accounting for born soldiers, right? If he has born soldiers, he's probably going to get a little more damage on you, and your warlocks are probably going to go down. However, if you run a warlock skyrunner, I know it's a little bit more points, but a warlock skyrunner also has the ability to be, well, basically benefit from Lookout Sir. So you're never going to get targeted by mortars that way. So that's why I like running warlock skyrunners instead, because if I'm facing down 3 units of mortars, I know that my warlock skyrunners are going to be safe pretty much for the entire game, because mortars cannot really do any damage against support weapons if they try. And again, you have tools of dealing with them throughout the game. They're not going to be able to kill you faster than you can kill them, right? Shadow Weavers, for example, are very effective against mortars and stuff like that. So yeah, anyway, warlocks and farseers are extremely effective in Uthway, and I could probably go on forever about them and all the different ways to use them. But for now, just if you're running Uthway, you probably want a lot of warlocks and a lot of farseers. Okay, so moving on to Vipers. So Vipers are actually really good with Uthway as well, and honestly, I didn't give Vipers enough credit in the beginning of the Codex. When the Codex first came out, I looked at the Viper and I thought, wow, okay, this is exactly the same as the old Viper. It doesn't really have any kind of bonuses or benefits over it. It's probably not the greatest. However, with the new secondary objectives that are good with Eldar, as well as the fact that you have Strands of Fate, with Uthway and stuff like that, I think Vipers are actually better. They're good in every list, really. At least a couple of them, or maybe even just one. But in Uthway, they're really great because not only can they body block and contest objectives, but they can also score on secondaries very easily. Things like behind enemy lines, for example. And these things are actually even cheaper than Wind Riders. So if you guys can get these behind enemy lines with the Uthway trait, basically having a 6+ invul save, and the ability to ignore mortal wounds, these things can be incredibly hard to take out. Your opponent cannot just take it out with a couple of psychic powers, right? Because you have that 5+ ignores mortal wounds. They also can't take it out with just one, last cannon or something like that, because you have Strands of Fate and you have that 6+ invul. So it actually makes it extremely difficult for opponents to deal with these things when behind enemy lines or even just in the open on objectives. So yes, your opponent may kill the Viper, but they will take more firepower than is typically required to do so, and that can help other units survive, and you'd be surprised. Sometimes it's just a matter of a couple wounds, that can maybe allow a unit of Wind Riders to survive on an objective long enough to score on it. Is it very likely in certain cases or against certain opponents? Probably not. You're probably going to still lose the Viper, you're still going to lose the Wind Riders, but it will take more resources for your enemy to do that, and that could affect other things in the game as well. So, it is a big benefit. And also something people don't really realize about the Viper that's another little benefit is that they can actually help you screen in the backfield. So if you use Rangers to forward deploy and you use them kind of as an offensive tool in the beginning to maybe make your support weapons more effective at shooting because of the Resonator Shard stratagem, if you are going to go for that in the first couple of turns to eliminate a key target, or even if you put them back in reserve, Vipers can still be used in the backfield to screen for you because they are pretty big, they're pretty long, so if you deploy them long ways, you can actually cover a significant amount of distance in the backfield where enemy units can't really get within range if they're coming in as reinforcements. Another cool thing about them that a lot of people don't realize, especially in Arks of Omen, is that you can use their length along the edge of the battlefield to block enemy strategic reserves very easily. Not a lot of enemy units can do that, So some armies can do this, like for example, Dark Eldar is very good at doing this because they have the Raider. The Raider is a very long and skinny model, so it can go on the side of a battlefield and basically block a large portion of it from enemy reinforcements being able to come in. The Viper can do the same thing, but is a little bit less effective at it if you're just taking one. Now, if you're taking two, basically for almost pretty much the same cost as a Raider, I think Raiders are about 85 points if I'm not mistaken, for pretty much the same cost as one Raider, you could have 2 Vipers and they could block the entire side of a battlefield for you. So, I don't particularly run groups of 2 Vipers in Uthway lists, but if you do have a meta that's very strategic reserve heavy, you can take 2 Vipers and block an entire side of the battlefield. With those models, because of the length of the model for 1, and for 2, the fact that you can run 2 of them and run them 4 inches apart. So it's pretty effective. And honestly, really extremely useful in a lot of different situations. So I love Vipers in Uthway. I think they're one of the best units you can take in an Uthway army now. Okay, so as promised, I am going to show you a 2,000 point Arks of Omen's Uthway list that I had retooled for Arks of Omen with the consideration that Hidden Path is no longer here and Behind Enemy Lines is buffed. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go into the list. So for HQ, I have Eldrad Uthran in this list. The reason being is because Eldrad, compared to other Farseers, is much more effective now because, well, honestly, simply, he didn't get nerfed, right? He didn't get nerfed in points or anything like that. So Eldrad Uthran still being at 145 points is a very good bargain. I gave him Fortune, Guide, and Fateful Divergence because, honestly, he's going to be staying in the back anyway with the support weapons. He's really not going to be moving forward too much. And having Fortune and Guide is very good for the Shroud Runners that I have in my list. And Fateful Divergence is just to farm command points throughout the game. You do need command points even late in the game, so I chose to go ahead and do that. He also has the Fate Reader Warlord trait for 1 command point. I also have a Farseer Skyrunner with Focus Will and Doom. Focus Will basically goes on anything that I need cast that turn, so if I really need a Will of Azurian to go off, or if I really need Doom, or honestly even Fortune Guide or Fateful Divergence to go off, I use the Farseer Skyrunner to cast that Psychic Power first. And when you cast it first, your Farseer will get a +1 to that because of the Uthway trait, and of course he also has Doom, because Doom's just awesome to have in any case. Especially against really heavy tanks. I think especially now you're going to be seeing people running heavier stuff. Rogaldorn battle tanks, Land Raiders, things like that basically got big buffs. Maybe not the Rogaldorn, but especially Land Raiders got cheaper. So you're going to be seeing more of those, and because of that, D-Cannons absolutely rip them apart. If you're able to cast Doom on it first, you really only need 1 battery of D-Cannons to wreck it, versus needing maybe 1.5 batteries. So of course, Doom is really useful to have. The last Farseer, I just threw a Singing Spear on him. There's no particular reason, I just needed the points to be filled. He has Will of Azurian though, and Ghost Walk. So Will of Azurian, of course, very important for this list because it does give objective secured to units like small units of Wind Riders and things like that, so that you can basically force enemies to give up objectives easier and make it harder for enemies to capture objectives in the late game. And let me tell you, there is nothing worse than losing an objective where you have more models on it to an enemy unit that has objective secured. In the beginning of this edition, I lost an objective to a single Space Marine Sergeant, and that was not good. So in defensive style lists, I always try to make sure to have that so that that doesn't happen. He also has Ghost Walk because honestly, in a lot of different cases, you may need that extra charge distance, even with something like a Farseer. For example, if you can't quite get to an objective that has an enemy unit on it and you really need it, and that enemy unit's not going to be able to kill your Farseer, having Ghost Walk to be able to cast on it does help. And lastly, I have Baroth of the Wind. So Baroth, honestly, I normally don't like running him, especially in Uthway lists. He kind of feels out of place, but he's actually really good with the secondary objective Behind Enemy Lines because he can basically score it whenever he wants. And he is a very defensive and utility-based Phoenix Lord that's very good in this type of list, so I did choose to run him. He's not there for dealing a lot of damage. He's just there to basically, if something needs to be killed that only has a couple units left or a couple models left, he's there to kill it and then go basically wherever he needs to be on the battlefield, whether that be on the other side to score behind enemy lines or on the other side of your own battlefield to, be safe from enemy fire. For my troops, I do have 2 units of Rangers with Wire Weave Nets. Again, these Wire Weave Nets are not necessary. I just put them in the list because I needed some points. But it kind of does help with negating charges and stuff like that. And because I know that the World Eaters Codex is right around the corner, I know that there's going to be a lot of crazy charges going off, maybe in the first couple turns even. So I chose to, put these in just to kind of maybe be a little bit of a road bump. Or, speed bump to those enemy berserkers and stuff like that, so that they don't just overwhelm you in one turn. The one thing about Uthway that they struggle with is if you do not have the right screens, a very fast combat-oriented army can just run right over you. So I did choose to use these. I thought that was the best use of the points in this case. The other cool thing about ranger units is that if you place them in strategic reserve via Phantasm, they can actually come in on turns 4 and 5. And I stated this a little bit at the beginning of the video, and maybe I'll do a more detailed video about this later on. But basically, because Phantasm is at the start of the first battle round and not before the first battle round starts, they actually don't count as destroyed if they come in after turn 3. And, this was actually something that was brought up to my attention from the Craftworld Eldar channel, and I honestly didn't think it worked that way. Me and my buddies actually had talked about this in the beginning. We were like, does it really work this way? Is this just a typo or something like that? We decided it was probably just a typo and that it was somewhere in the errata. Well, hey, guess what? It turns out it's not in the errata, and they never actually fixed it or looked into it at all. So it still works like that. And basically, yeah, that's how the rules are written for this interaction. So unless your opponent is, very against you being able to do this for whatever reason, you can do it. So I would talk to your opponent about doing this before the game starts, because if you just don't tell them about it and then halfway in the game you're like, oh yeah, these guys can come in on turns 4 and 5, your opponent might be a little bit upset about that. So you should let them know that using Phantasm allows them to come in on turns 4 and 5, because strategic reserves that are placed in strategic reserve, or units that are placed in strategic reserve after the start of the battle round, don't get destroyed on turn 3 if they don't come in via those reserves. Okay. Anyway, so let's go ahead and look at the elites. We have 3 Warlock Skyrunners. One of them has Protect and Jinx and the Impair Senses psychic power with the Ghost Helm of Alashazir. And the reason I picked Impair Senses is because a lot of lists now are running aura-based abilities on big Death Star units of like Thunderhammer, Stormshield, Terminator, so it was really just a tech for that. I have a couple of opponents that like to use that, and I know that it's kind of popular in the meta right now. But if you did want to switch that out for Crushing Orb or something like that, have a little bit more offensive power, I guess you could do that as well. There's no big deal with that. And this is the Warlock that's going to be used primarily for psychic secondaries. So Warp Ritual, for example, moving it forward, casting Warp Ritual and trying to get that 9+ undeniable, and then basically getting quickened back with the other Warlock Skyrunner who has Quicken and Restrain. So you can do this 3 turns and basically score 12 points on it. It's a very great way of scoring secondary points. And the plus side to this is you have 2 other turns in which you can cast Jinx on enemy units or Protect on your own units, which is the plan, right? If I have Shroud Runners in my list, which I do, I can cast Protect on them, put them onto an objective in the middle of the field and actually be quite durable. And if the enemy army has a really powerful unit that has great saves, I can also debuff that unit if need be. So I have a lot of flexibility there. Also have a Warlock Skyrunner with Conceal and Reveal for basically the same thing. It's just kind of there to cast Conceal on units of Shroud Runners to make them more durable. And lastly, I have 5 Striking Scorpions. The Exarch has a Biting Blade and Crushing Blows, of course. And this unit is actually just to throw enemy units off and try to delay the enemy advance if I get the first turn. And also, a unit of Striking Scorpions can very easily get into the enemy deployment zone and score on behind enemy lines during the first turn, if you get the first turn, right? You may not get the first turn, but you can always use Phantasm to move these guys back in strategic reserve, and guess what? Just like Rangers, these guys can also come in on turns 4 and 5 if benefiting from that Phantasm redeployment. But honestly, if not, they're a really good unit for trading, and they're a really good unit for basically punching the enemy hard in the first turn and throwing their plans off. So being able to even just kill a unit of Space Marines with these guys and then maybe kind of block enemies from moving forward is a great way to delay the enemy and, of course, play a very defensive game. For my fast attack, I have a unit of 5 Shroud Runners, which at a reduced cost of 150 is an excellent unit for basically doing damage throughout the game, and then in the late game, because they're a 5-man unit, being able to benefit from a lot of defensive buffs and be able to capture an objective. I have a unit of 3 Shroud Runners, which is a disruption unit. So I use a unit of 3 Shroud Runners in a lot of lists now because it's a very good way of scoring behind enemy lines turn 1. So like I said previously in this video, basically I just use their advanced move to move up, and I use their normal move to move up again, and then basically block enemy units, get good angles on maybe more fragile units in the backfield, and block enemy movement with the Wire Weave Grenade stratagem as well as their regular base size, which is quite large. So you can actually make a significant impact with only a unit of 3. I also have 2 units of 3 Wind Riders with Shuriken Catapults, and these are basically just 2 units that can either be deployed on the battlefield and used for trading, so they can be put on an objective in the early game to block enemy units from being able to easily capture them. But another way that I've been using these recently is like this. So Space Marines have this new ability where they can basically just walk onto an objective and then walk off, and unless an enemy unit contests or captures that objective, they count as in control of that objective. So basically they can just walk off the objective, that Marine unit can do other stuff, and that objective still counts as theirs. Eldar are pretty good at denying this, and Wind Riders especially are really good at it because they can just go onto it, capture it, and then for 60 points, force that Marine unit to have to deal with them, which that Marine unit may actually not be in a position to do later in the game because it'll be dead. So I basically either use these guys for trading and doing things like that, or I also like to use them for blocking certain charge lanes and things, or just scoring on behind enemy lines. They're a very versatile unit, and having 2 small units of these gives me a lot of options. And honestly, if I'm going second, I can also just put them in strategic reserve. I can have them come in later in the game. And lastly, I do have 2 Vipers with scatter lasers, and these are just basically, like I said before, to be used to capture objectives, perform secondary actions, and just mess with enemy units. Maybe get behind enemy lines, maybe block up an enemy unit from charging or something like that. They're very cheap and very good for what they do, so I do run a couple of Vipers, as cheap as they get with the scatter lasers in this list. Although if you do want to run scatter lasers with Bright Lances, I don't think that's a bad thing either. They're a little more points, but they do punch a little harder, so it just really depends how you want to use them. And lastly, I have the heavy hitters of the list, the heavy support. We have 2 units of 3 support weapons with D cannons. These are the heavy hitters. These are what basically put fear into your opponent of moving into certain areas of the board because they just do so much damage. A lot of anti-tank damage, and honestly, with the buffs that you can give Uthway Guardian units, they're fantastic. And they provide that hard-hitting backbone that a defensive list like this really needs. And lastly, I have 3 support weapons with Shadow Weavers. Now, this wasn't something I always included, but I feel like these guys are really good in this type of list because what this list lacks is an easy way of destroying units like Cultists or units like Imperial Guard who like to sit on back objectives with maybe just a unit of 10 guys and just kind of cap it for the rest of the game. And unless you're advancing on units like Imperial Guard, that really, a type of list like this really doesn't have a lot of tools to deal with that, right? So if my opponent has a unit of 10 Imperial Guardsmen sitting on an objective behind some obscuring terrain in the backfield, there's not a lot that can threaten that unit, and you're probably going to get an opponent that scores a lot of primary points throughout the game doing that. So that's why I chose to include this unit, because 3 Shadow Weavers can absolutely shred a unit of Guardsmen, especially with the right buffs. So that unit of Guardsmen is not going to be safe, and they're not going to score nearly as many secondary points throughout the game. And also, they're really good at taking out things like mortars. They're really good at taking out, units of smaller Marines in the backfield that maybe are just hiding and waiting for an opportunity to counterattack against you. So having a unit of these is also very good, especially with the loss of Armor of Contempt. They just hit a lot harder than they used to. So yeah, that's my list. It's so far been pretty effective, and I have to say, Uthway is still extremely strong and obviously still one of the big 3 competitive Eldar Craftworlds. And I think with the loss of Hidden Path, a lot of people started to doubt that Uthway was still good. They started to say things like, oh, well, I can't score on Hidden Path on certain missions anymore, so maybe the defensive Uthway list is going the way of the dodo. And I actually couldn't disagree more. I think you just kind of have to change the list a little bit and make a few tweaks, but you don't have to change the successful formula of the list. You don't have to change the support weapons. You don't have to change the defensive strategy of the list. You just kind of need to switch a few units around so that you can score on things like behind enemy lines, which actually fits in pretty perfectly with Shroud Runners, Rangers, and of course, Wind Riders and Vipers, which are really fast units that can score that secondary objective, but they're also very defensive. You can use them in multiple ways. Shroud Runners, Rangers, and Wind Riders, as well as Vipers, which I don't mention here, but they're also useful in defending areas of the board and blocking and being very defensive as well. So they can be offensive and they can score you behind enemy lines, but they can also be very defensive, which basically plays in perfectly to the type of list that Uthway and the type of game that Uthway likes to play. And again, I mean, I think the basic thing of this is that the Uthway faction has a great set of traits that are absolutely fantastic, and they make some of the best use of D-cannons and support weapons, which are the best anti-tank unit in the entire codex. And honestly, I say that with full chest. I really like fire dragons, I really like fire prisms, but I think that both of those units, even though they're solid, come nowhere close to how effective D-cannons can be in an Uthway list. Again, if you're running Biel-Tan, you're probably not going to run as many D-cannons. Maybe you just have 1 or 2 units of them. Or maybe even just, you have 1 unit of D-cannons maybe, and you're running fire dragons, which fire dragons are very good in a Biel-Tan list because of Wrath of the Shrines. And fire prisms are really good in a Biel-Tan list. But for Uthway, D-cannons just rise far and above and beyond both of those options. So yeah, Uthway I think is still really strong, and I think you're going to be seeing a lot of tournament lists that are doing very well with Uthway still. I think just recently there was a tournament where an Uthway player was running a Wraith Knight. I think it was an Uthway player from Goonhammer, if I'm not mistaken, was running a Wraith Knight in one of his lists, and he placed 4th in a very big tournament. So again, Uthway is still a faction that I think can be very competitive, very strong, and I think going forward in Arks of Omen, we're going to see Uthway doing pretty good in tournament play as far as the Craftworld Eldar go. Alright everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Peace out, I'll see you guys next time. If you do have a comment, please leave it in the comment section if you want to talk about Uthway, if you want to talk about, Eldar in general, let me know. I love reading your guys' comments and answering them when I can. I do also have a Patreon for those of you who want to support the channel a little bit further. Obviously, no pressure there, but I will leave the link in the description if you want to toss a couple of bucks here and there to help the channel improve the type of content that I can create. All right, everybody, see you guys later. More content to come. I have a video coming up covering Shroud Runners a little bit more in detail. I also want to do a video covering the Wraith Knight list that I've been running, which, to be honest, I just had a couple of games with it this weekend against some different opponents, and I have to say it's a mixed bag. I think it can be really successful against some type of lists, and then against other type of lists, it's really hard to manage and really hard to run. But it was a blast either way. I had a lot of fun with it, and I can't wait to show you guys my conclusions that, I have about the list and about Wraith Knights in general when run in a Craftworld Eldar army. All right, everybody, peace out, and see you guys next time. Have a good one.